This is part two of a two-part series, two-part video series on Congress, and I've essentially entitled this "The Constitution and Congress." And so what we are doing is we're looking at some basic guidelines for in the Constitution for that first branch of government called Congress. So in the first video, I walked through several sections. And I ended looking at the power that the Congress has, that check that the legislative branch has over the executive branch. And whenever we get to our discussion of the judicial branch, we'll see what checking powers the legislative branch has over the judicial branch. But now I wanted to focus on just a little bit of focus on the president, that is the checking power that the Constitution gives the legislative branch over the executive branch. And remember, what we're trying to do with these checking powers, in the words of Madison, or in the thinking of James Madison, is we're trying to avoid tyranny. And he thought tyranny would exist if power rested really in one single branch of government. So that's why we have three different branches. It's really to avoid tyranny. And the reason you want to avoid tyranny is because government's job is to secure natural rights, and tyrants tend not to worry about people's rights. Tyrants will come across as selling themselves as doing what's in the good of the people, but ultimately what it comes down to is they're going to do what they want to do. Whether we're talking about tyranny in one person, tyranny in a small group of people, or tyranny or political power, we've had it in the history of the world in all of those instances. But in our Constitution, they're trying to avoid tyranny existing. And so we saw from the last video that in part one that the House of Representatives is given the power to impeach. But I shared with you all then the way that it's set up. Impeachment is not actually removing a president, and the focus is on the president right now. Other members of government can be impeached and removed as well, but our focus here is on the president. So the House of Representatives then is given in the Constitution the power to impeach, but because we're splitting that chamber in two, we have two chambers. We have the House and the Senate. As James Madison again said, what we're trying to do is offset these two branches, or rather these two chambers of that one branch, against one another. So they have checking powers one over the other. So the trial on the removal of a president, the trial on that accusation by the House, that trial has got to take place in the Senate. And as you'll see in this particular PowerPoint slide, we have had three presidents impeached. Three separate presidents impeached by the House of Representatives, none of them removed by the Senate. So in all three instances where all three presidents were accused by the House of Representatives for committing high crimes and misdemeanors and other misdemeanors in the language of the Constitution, the Senate actually refused to remove in every single instance that there has been an impeachment, an accusation by the House. So the first impeachment was kind of an unusual time in American history. 1868, you have Abraham Lincoln's vice president. Now you remember that you may recall that Abraham Lincoln was the very first Republican president, and he was first elected in 1860. And then he began to serve office in 1861, and that basically began the Civil War. Well, the Civil War ended in 1865, and Abraham Lincoln had already won re-election during the Civil War when that was going on. And then he was eventually, during that second term, he was assassinated. Someone, of course, shot him in the back of the head while he was watching a play at by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. When that happened, Andrew Johnson became the president, because Andrew Johnson was the vice president, was Abraham Lincoln's vice president. This was an unusual time in history, and Abraham Lincoln did something that we don't typically do today. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, but his vice president was actually a Democrat. And keep this in mind that most of the Democratic Party states were in the South, and so they seceded. But there were a couple of states that were still in the power of Democrats, not Republicans, and they chose not to secede. So this is one of those Democrats who chose not to secede. He's what's referred to as a war Democrat because he's in favor of the war. He doesn't like the idea of secession, but he's not a Republican either. So you got a Republican president and a Democratic Party vice president. And you've got a Congress that's basically controlled by the Republican Party in the North. Now, keep this in mind. 1868. This is during the Reconstruction, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. And in a separate video, I'm going to talk more about impeachment and what I think are the actual legal, legitimate grounds for impeachment. But essentially, what you've got here is you've got radical Republicans in the House of Representatives who want to impeach a Democratic Party president, and the official reason for wanting to impeach him is for violation of the Tenure of Office Act. Basically, he fired a member of his cabinet, but the real motivation behind this, frankly, was very, very political. He was a Democrat, and you have the House of Representatives in control of what are referred to today as radical Republicans who want to come down hard on the South. And that House of Representatives impeached him, but they didn't really accuse him of committing a crime. And when I get into the presidency, I'll talk more about why I think the president has to commit a crime before he can be legitimately impeached and then removed. Well, nonetheless, the House of Representatives did impeach him, but when it moved over to trial in the Senate, the Senate refused to remove him. They had a trial there, and they didn't remove this president. I guess you could say that the radical Republicans were not in charge of the Senate. And again, I do think that this was politically motivated. The radical Republicans wanted to come down hard on the South. They wanted to keep military rule in the South, including Texas, and they wanted to keep a lot of those Southern Democrats who had sworn allegiance to the Confederate States of America. The radical Republicans didn't want to let these people have their voting rights back after the war. Andrew Johnson, that Democratic Party president, was a little bit more sympathetic and didn't want to come down as hard on the South. Now, we have another president who was impeached, the second one. This is Bill Clinton. You all recognize the name, of course. Now, this one here, I think, was more in line with what the framers had in mind whenever they set up the power of impeachment, because he was accused. President Clinton was accused of actually committing perjury before a federal grand jury, which can get you. It's a crime, and I think it's got to be a crime in order for an actual impeachment to occur. So you've got the House of Representatives, and all they have to do is by a simple majority actually produce articles of impeachment. The House of Representatives produced articles of impeachment, and the accusation was lying to a federal grand jury. That House of Representatives was controlled by Republicans at the time, but in the Senate, if you're going to have a trial to remove, you have to have 2/3. The Senate has to have 2/3 majority, not a simple majority, to actually remove. And so in this instance as well, the Senate refused to remove a president that had been impeached. Now we get here to our own time, your own time. That other one, the Clinton impeachment and trial on impeachment, I remember that very well. But then you have this president here. The previous president, so as I'm making this video, Joe Biden is president, so you all are familiar with Donald Trump. Donald Trump was first impeached by the House of Representatives, and the first time around, the accusation, again, was not because he committed a crime. So Donald Trump was impeached twice by the House of Representatives. In both instances, the House of Representatives was controlled by the Democratic Party. So I want you to see what's going on here with the impeachments. It's really not just about committing a crime. It's about political power and struggle between the two political parties. It plays a major role in it. So in this impeachment that occurred the first time around for Donald Trump, this was a this was not an accusation of him committing a crime, but rather that it was an abuse of power, obstruction of justice of Congress when they were doing an investigation. And the vote in the House of Representatives to remove him, or rather to impeach him, which only has to be by a simple majority in the House, went right along party lines. In other words, essentially what happened is all the Democrats voted to impeach him and all the Republicans voted not to impeach him. So you can see it's a political party struggle. Again, no accusation of committing a crime. The Senate, however, the Senate refused to remove him. They had a trial, refused to remove him, and this was by what was necessary was a 2/3 majority, but the Senate was controlled by the Republican Party. They didn't even come close to him to getting a 2/3 majority. One Republican did cross over, and for Article 1, the first impeachment article, the second article, though, was right along party lines. In other words, all the Democratic Party senators, they voted to remove him, and all the Republican Party senators voted to acquit him. Now, what happened, of course, after that is he was impeached again. Trump was. I also want to remind you that I truly think that this is largely politically motivated, and I think they all were largely politically motivated, except that when Bill Clinton was impeached, the accusation I think was constitutional, and that is that the accusation was he committed perjury by lying to a federal grand jury about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. Remember that? I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. You may remember those words. You probably do. Most government students remember that. So it was an accusation against Bill Clinton that he had committed a crime. Well, this time around, the second time that he's impeached by the House of Representatives, again, the accusation is that I do think the grounds were constitutional. That doesn't mean that there wasn't political party motivation. Of course there was. But here, you all know about storming the Capitol after the election results were certified, and you all may recall that that was the accusation by the Democratic Party. And the House of Representatives, the second time around, is still controlled by the Democratic Party. The accusation is, well, that would have never happened had Donald Trump not encouraged people to go storm the Capitol. Well, there was only one article of impeachment, and the issue was incitement of an insurrection, which is a crime. So I do think the grounds are constitutional. But again, the Senate acquitted the president. There wasn't the necessary 2/3 majority to remove him. So when we get to the president, I'll come back and visit this again when we look at another module in this course. This was, by the way, a very, very unprecedented impeachment in many, many ways. It was an impeachment that occurred 1 week before his term was to expire. He had actually lost the election, and so the Democrats definitely had other motivations involved rather than just removing him, because he was going to be gone in a week anyway. And we'll come back and look at that when we look at the presidency. Now, I'm going to look at a few other things, and then we're going to call it quits for this video. So Article 1, Section 7 has a number of important things in it. And again, I want to encourage you to get out the Constitution and pause this video, look at it. But Article 1, Section 7 says that bills that create taxes must originate in the House of Representatives. So the Senate gets the vote on it. The Senate can join the debate, but the Constitution in Article 1, Section 7 says that essentially any tax on the American people, that bill has got to originate in the House of Representatives. And again, I think part of it is because the members of the House are up for re-election every 2 years. The members of the Senate are up for re-election every 6 years. So if a tax is unpopular in the House, well, that representative that sponsored it and all the representatives that voted for it, they can lose their election next time around. Okay. Another thing is that Article 1, Section 7 says that before a bill can become a law, it has to pass through both chambers. Later on in this module and in your textbook, You'll learn more about taking a bill and turning it into a law, the bill to law process. But the Constitution says in Article 1, Section 7 that both chambers have to pass that bill, and the wording has got to be identical, which is easier said than done. Also, it says that the president, this is where the president has his veto power. Where does it come from? It comes out of Article 1, Section 7 of the U.S. Constitution. So the president has veto power over bills, which we'll talk more about later on in this module, as well as in our module on the presidency. Now, Article 1, Section 8, you've already seen, so I'm not going to elaborate a lot on it. We looked at this when we looked at the topic of federalism, and I was trying to share with you all, and your textbook was teaching about state sovereignty, and how Article 1, Section 8 basically has a list of subjects over which Congress has the power to regulate. So these are the enumerated powers, and it's just a list of subjects that the federal government, Congress specifically, has the authority to make laws about. And I have to say again that that is a pretty short list for the most powerful country in the world today, economically and militarily speaking, that is. And we've been that way for a long time. We won't be on top forever. But it's a very, very short list for a very, very powerful nation. And essentially what that does is if you don't find it on the list, if you don't find a subject on the list, then it's left to the states. So Article 1, Section 8 contains the enumerated powers. It's just simply a list of subjects about which Congress can make laws about. Article 1, Section 10, again, we've seen this in our topic of federalism. Article 1, Section 8 told us the things that Congress can make laws about. Article 1, Section 10 tells us the things that states can't do. And one of those things that the states can't do is print and coin money. I mean, we want to have consistency in money, right, all across the country. And so states are actually prohibited from doing that. Only the federal government can print currency. In some instances, the powers are allowed to the states, but only with Congress's permission. So you may recall that Article 1, Section 10, as we saw in our look at federalism, does allow each state to have a standing army, which we would call today the Texas National Guard. Although we do have a Texas State Guard, and we have a Texas Army National Guard and a Texas Air National Guard. But the state of Texas and all the other states are allowed to have standing armies with the permission of Congress. So Congress in the National Guard Act decades ago, and even prior to that, the Congress has allowed the states to have their own military. I think that's all we're going to be looking at as far as this topic goes regarding the powers that Congress has. I do want to look at one other thing, though. In Article 2, this is one of the checks that the Senate specifically has over the president. And I did mention this in part 1. I'm going to go back and show you where it is. So in Article 2, the president can make important decisions, but those decisions are checked by the Senate, not the House. For instance, the Constitution makes the President of the United States the chief diplomat and representative of the country to other countries, to the international community. He can negotiate contracts with other countries, and I'm calling a treaty basically a contract between countries. The President negotiates it, but it really doesn't function as a law as a binding contract until Senate by 2/3 majority specifically ratifies that treaty. So the President negotiates it, brings it back home, shows it to the Senate, and the Senate gives their advice and consent using the words of the Constitution. The same thing with presidential appointments, and we can use the U.S. Supreme Court just as an example. The Constitution does give the President the power to nominate people in high positions in the judicial branch, as well as members of the executive branch too, like diplomats and members of the cabinet. So the president nominates these people, but that decision to nominate them has got to get the thumbs up from the Senate, not the House, but the Senate, and they do this by way of a simple majority. So this 2/3 majority is only, as far as giving consent to presidential action, is only applicable to treaties. When you're talking about nominees to the U.S. Supreme Court, that decision by the president needs to be ratified only by a simple majority. A heck of a lot easier to get a simple majority than 2/3 majority. I think we're going to call it quits for this video, and you'll need to read your textbook. There'll be other things posted online as well, so that'll be it.